Welcome back to Dylan's World podcast. Thank you guys for tuning in. Enjoy the show. Okay. Nika Gueci, correct?
Yes,
All
correct.
right. Thank you for being here. I was introduced to what you do by researching some of the. I got introduced somehow to the center at ASU, the Center for Mindfulness. Um,
hmm
and then I found out you were the director for a while, and that was what led me into reaching out to you because you're working with, at least for a while, you were working with the youth
hmm
and helping people to discover some of these techniques. So I want to ask you what to introduce yourself briefly and what your role was with Center and what you're currently doing, and then also your personal work if you do something outside of that.
Yeah, so I do a couple of things. First, I'm really happy to be here, so thank you for inviting me to your
Mm.
show. Um, so I am now under the office of the Chief Wellness Officer at ASU, so it's just a little bit more of an expanded role, but I did work at the Center for Mindfulness, Compassion, and Resilience. I was their executive director for about 7 years since the very inception of the center. And kind of built that up from the ground. And personally, I also do a consulting business for corporate wellness where I work with employees to build their wellness strategy and bring more resilience to their employees individually and as a community as well.
Hmm. And what are some of the tools that you would leverage with the center? What kind of projects would you guys do with students or staff members? What was the basis for a lot of the work that you guys did?
Yeah, well, when we started, it was 2017, 2016, 2017. And I think mindfulness was less well known then than it is now. It wasn't as mainstream as it is now. And so when we started, we kind of had to talk about all of the data and the science behind mindfulness to get people interested in it. So there was that group of people. And then there was also a group of people that was just really hungry for it,
Mm-hmm.
that really needed stress reduction, that wanted to get more out of life. And so we worked with students, faculty, and staff, and also with the broader Phoenix community and actually across the United States as well. We had an open door policy where people who wanted to build a program or build an initiative, they could come to us, and they did. We wouldn't bang down any doors. Mindfulness should never be mandatory, right? Wellness is should be voluntary and done when you're ready for it.
Mm-hmm. And what was, out of curiosity, what were some of the personal starting points for you? Like what got you interested in the first place in mindfulness? Because I'm sure that this is a long journey. So, and then I would also like you to define what you feel mindfulness is and what meditation means to you, and kind of like give me a little bit of background as to how you became interested in that stuff in the first place.
Yeah, well, it actually started with my mom. She started doing yoga when I was little, and so she would teach me yoga. And then when I got older, I was doing it myself, and I got my yoga teacher training and certification. And I've always worked in wellness adjacent fields. So I've worked in universities and public health for 15 or 20 years now, and I've worked on everything from suicide prevention to substance use and recovery to mindfulness to compassion. And what it really is to me is skill building. It's life skills. When somebody says that these are soft skills, they're
Mm.
not. They're life skills. Um, and I wrote down this great quote that defines mindfulness.
Yeah, had some internet difficulties, and we were on that track with mindfulness.
Yes.
Um, but we can circle back. We can circle back to it.
Okay.
Um, so So yeah, I mean, I would just if I'm just going to ask you if you want to continue elaborating on that quote, and if you want to reread it, you're welcome to.
Okay.
Um, yeah.
Okay. So I'll reread it and I'll try to remember what I said. All right. So this is a great quote about mindfulness that I really love by Dr. Barry Curzon. He is the personal physician to the Dalai Lama. He's the founder of the Altruism in Medicine Institute. And we've done several events with him. And this is what he said about mindfulness during one of those events. Mindfulness is about a thorough, careful, and calm examination of the contents of our experience. An examination that can radically alter our interpretation of that experience through observing within ourselves our thoughts and emotions. So I love that this definition of mindfulness is that, yes, mindfulness is a presence in the moment, but it's also a way to see the world from a larger perspective, from a broader
Hmm.
perspective, where you are both the actor and the observer within your own life. So it's a way to see more clearly how you act, how other people act. And it takes you out of that isolated, kind of narrow, habitual response that we usually engage in and takes us out to a broader shift in our perspective.
Hmm. Interesting. It's when I first got introduced to some of these ideas, it was illuminating to me, and it's simple, but it's like I remember, when I was younger, I had some like spiritual undertones to my upbringing, specifically like around Christianity
Me too.
and some other things. But then I remember being 17 and I was doing martial arts, so I got this book on Amazon. I guess at the time it was the Way of the Peaceful Warrior by Dan Millman.
Mm,
And then I remember again, it was interesting because seems simple now, but I was really illuminated by the fact that we can kind of be the observer of our thoughts and actions, and
mhm,
then also he talked a lot about attachment. So if we get what we want, we suffer. If we don't get what we want, we suffer. If we get exactly what we want, we still suffer because we can't hold on to it. And so the teachings around mindfulness and people like that are surrounded with like the Dalai Lama or Thich Nhat Hanh or some of these Buddhist teachings were really illuminating for me about how to exist in this world. Um, so over time, what were I'm curious what some of the things you were seeing with college students, with people generally, but working with younger people. Are you seeing a lot of suffering and
yes,
distraction?
yes,
And
yes. And especially now, the world has really changed from the time that we started the Center for Mindfulness to now. And I think largely that shift had to do with the pandemic and everything else that's going on in the world. But people are suffering because they are lonely. We have a huge epidemic of loneliness and social isolation that our culture perpetuates. And people also, I'm noticing, are not great at dealing with stress. So, what I see a lot, especially with the younger generation, is that normal human emotions and experiences are being pathologized to
mm,
something that is kind of blown out of proportion to what they really are. And I think part of that stems from the loneliness and social isolation because we don't see other people going through exactly the same thing that we're going through, right?
hmm. So you're saying maybe like trauma, let's say, or anxiety. So sometimes, of course, those can be pathological,
Mhm.
but they're being exacerbated from your perspective.
Yes, that's what I'm seeing. Um, And that's not to take away people who have actually experienced trauma and who do have significant mental health challenges. But I think some of what we're seeing is that normal human things that we go through as human beings are being called a sickness, and it's not. It's just
Hmm.
what happens in life. You know, breakups, grief, everyday stress. It's something that we're not really equipped to handle anymore. And it is because we're so alone. We're so isolated. We're on our screens all the time. And we largely act alone.
Hmm. Yeah, I see similar things. I mean, especially now with the screen addiction and with if you go to a coffee shop or if you go out, you see so many people just hunched over their phones. And, I do the same things. It's nice to bring your computer somewhere and
Yeah.
get some emails done on your laptop and stuff like that. But you see a lot of lonely individuals. And then it's interesting. I actually really didn't always correlate those two things between the pathologizing of basic or not basic, but regular human negative experiences,
Hmm.
um, and then pathologizing them. I didn't really put those two things together, but that makes a lot of sense. And so I did want to ask you as well, and I know I asked a little bit of your background, but
Hmm.
when did you really start leaning into some of these teachings, and were there specific experiences in your life that really like elevated the experiences of mindfulness or that where they became very important?
Yeah. Yeah. I think so. So, I've been working in this field for uh, a while, and I've gathered a lot of those human personal narratives. I have professional experience. My dissertation was on providing support for students in substance use recovery and creating peer-to-peer interventions. So a lot of mindfulness training. We did a lot of mindfulness training for that, and then um, I'm married now, but I was married before, and I was married to a man named Ryan, and he was going to school to be a nurse before, and I was going to school to get my master's. And he also, so he had a botched shoulder operation, and he got into opiates. And then when he became a nurse, he had access to morphine. So he got into morphine. And then when he was fired for using morphine, he went to heroin and he was dead in a year. So I became a widow at 30. And
Mm.
I think that that experience really, and I say that not for sympathy, but to illustrate how much mindfulness and wellness really means to my life. Because I think that personally, if I did not have the practice of meditation, the practice of yoga before this happened, I wouldn't have had decent coping strategies after, right? So you kind of
Mm.
need to develop those skills before the bad thing happens so that you can have them for afterwards, right? It's much harder to develop those skills after the bad thing happens. And then I also think a lot about community wellness and community resilience because, and this has to do with loneliness too, because I think about, what if he did have the spaces that I'm creating right now? What if he had those support structures in school and at work? Would things have turned out differently? I don't think that we can count on individual resilience only. We really need to focus on community resilience and looking out for each other. And that's
Hmm.
something that we're really missing right now. Because the onus cannot be on the individual, it can't be on one person. It really needs to be around community support. It needs to be around people who care, a culture of caring, right? And then things might have turned out differently,
Mm.
you know?
We are social creatures and we need the support. We can't. exist as islands. I've come to learn as um, yeah, I think that's I mean, I just turned 30 last week, so I think being equipped to deal with such a loss at a young age when your kind of love should technically be beginning
Hmm.
um, creates it's a lot of suffering.
Yeah.
And I grew up around a lot of addicts, and I have close friends that died from my high school when they were 19, 20, 21 years old.
Yeah.
So I've seen that too, and like not in the same context for sure, but definitely just this where this leads when you start with one thing and
Hmm.
end up in the next. And I think having your practice rooted in something that having your mindfulness practice rooted in something that gives you the ability to deal with that depth of suffering is a lot better than just positive thinking, let's
Hmm.
say. And I'm and like I'm happy to give that its credit, because sometimes you just gotta. Sometimes it's true. You just have to like reshape the way you're thinking about something and think positively, and it can make a difference. But that's a lot more surface level than like sitting with suffering
Well, and
and.
sometimes things are just horrible, right? And no
Mm,
amount of positive thinking is going to get you out of it. Sometimes really bad things happen.
hmm
And I think as a society, we don't really know how to deal with them. We don't know how to deal with other people's grief. We don't know how to deal with our own grief. Um, yeah, so I cut you off. I didn't mean to do that.
No, not at all. You're good. Well, I did want to ask you too. I mean, um, relating. I mean, death is a huge part of, let's say, Buddhism or a large number of mindfulness practices, because we're constantly in a state of loss and
Hmm.
change.
Hmm.
We're also in a cycle of rebirth all the time as well. But did you learn a lot about yourself and the culture from dealing with such intense grief and loss early in your life?
Yeah, it um, it really did taught me a lot. And if you, I would never say that I'm lucky to have an experience like that, but in some ways, it does show you the depth of human experience. And this is something that mindfulness teaches me as well, is that we're so intent on looking for happiness and for joy and for, I want this for myself and I want that for myself. And that's the emotion that we strive for. But then something terrible does happen and we experience the exact opposite. And so there's such a wide spectrum of what it means to be human. And I think that I experienced a lot of that, the both the depths and the joys. And for that, I wouldn't say, again, I wouldn't say that I feel lucky, but that I got to experience that in my life. Not that I
Mm,
had to, I got to, you know?
mm.
Does that make sense?
It does. It makes sense. Um, I think, yeah, experiencing the whole spectrum of emotion and self, and you are correct. I mean, a lot of people are scared
Hmm.
to help someone else with such intense emotions. I actually have a book called The Five Invitations by Frank Ostaseski. Are you familiar with that?
I think so.
It's about what dying can teach us about living more fully. And he started something at the time called the Zen Hospice Project, which I don't
Mm.
believe exists, or it has transformed into something else now. And that book was important for me to read. And it's so intimate because he's like really there at the depths of
Hmm.
like the hardest moments in people's lives. And there's not enough of that narrative now. And people get really uncomfortable talking about grief or loss specifically. And we don't want to think about it. We want to think that it's out there somewhere. And then once it happens, it's like, oh, that person's in a better place. But the reality is you don't have this person anymore. And like, how can I continue to operate from that space? And
Hmm.
what were some of the over time? What were some of the tools like for you to manage suffering, not just related to this situation, but all situations? Like, what are some good tools for you to manage your suffering and your happiness?
Um, Definitely other people. Other people have a huge role to play. It's hard to be resilient on your own. It's hard to find happiness on your own. And when suffering occurs, mindfulness, meditation, these are great skills to have within yourself. So building that resilience within yourself is really important. As is leaning on other people and knowing who to lean on. You also learn who takes your energy and who saps your energy, and try to spend more time with the people who give you life rather than sap it away from you. So I'd say that inner resilience, but also being around other people and finding support with them, and kind of knowing that it's okay to do that. I think a lot of
Mm,
people are also afraid um, of asking for support, of asking for help, or they don't know how to ask, or they don't know what to ask for. And even in everyday situations, I mean, everyday life produces great stress and can add to significant wear and tear on your body, your mental health, your soul. And it's important to ask for help. It's important to know how to build these skills within yourself.
and what teachers do you really have you resonated with? Are there specific authors, lecturers, books that you've like leaned into, or is it a multitude?
Yes, it is a multitude, but Pima Chodron, I love her.
Okay.
She is a Buddhist nun. And right now I'm reading The Art of Happiness by the Dalai
Mm.
Lama. So I lean on, and of course, Barry Curzon, who I mentioned. That's a good question. Yeah, I don't know. Let's skip
Mm.
that one because I,
Have
I can't answer.
That's cool. Have you read Thich Nhat Hanh as
Yes,
well?
of course. Of
Cool.
course.
So I think, yeah, I've leaned on him as well as a teacher, and I don't know. It's interesting that so many experiences in life come come full circle. One of the this is I agree with you on being around other people. I think that we have our self, so our like our auto regulation, and then we have interactive regulation. And as a social animal, having interactive regulation for the nervous system and for the brain, and to realize you're not losing it, it's really important to surround yourself when you can with people that care about you and have your best interest, and at least just even just being not isolated. And are you, if you communicate with some of these like students,
Hmm.
and is that what you're is that what you are seeing with them, is that they're experiencing isolation, and then what are the effects of that for them in their life?
Yeah, I think a lot of them have missed. So I'll give you an example of how this shows up in an everyday circumstance. I do a lot of presentations, and some of them I do in the classroom, and some of them I do in the community. And I went into this classroom full of students, and I remember years ago that when you walk into a classroom, it's bustling, right? People are talking, they're meeting up with one another, they're seeing each other for the week, and they're talking to one another. And I walked into this classroom, and no, it was silent. Nobody
Hmm.
was talking. Nobody was talking. And that tells you something, right? That tells you that even those loose connections that of people that you might just see once a week or once a month, those are being lost. So even if you have those deep connections with your family or your best friends, you're missing those everyday interactions, and that helps build community. those loose connections. And I'm not seeing that anymore.
You got to wonder if it's our choice, which it partially is with our free will, but also some of this stuff is just orchestrated addiction by technocrats that want to numb the shit out of you and
Absolutely.
mold society in a fashion that they want to see it go.
Absolutely. When people are scared, they're compliant, and we're all
Mm.
scared.
And people, and then just having like things like TikTok and Instagram Reels and just the constant stimuli for a young mind, and then Hinge and Tinder and like, so again, you're not interacting with the cute girl next to you, but for some reason it's acceptable to swipe on a bunch of random ones. It's a
Hmm.
not nothing inherently against that, but it takes away from what your natural inclination is, which would be to talk to the girl next to you instead of I don't know. I think that, and it's making us suffer, but these apps are addictive, and again, you have these tech freaks that know how to orchestrate things, and
Yep.
engineers, and that are getting us into these addictive models and making us obsessed and making us lonelier,
Yep.
and then we're spending money to to uplift them. So,
And then we're just consumers of content. We're just
mm,
either producers or consumers of content. And that leaves very little room for deep thinking because we're just constantly consuming. We're just constantly numbing ourselves with Instagram or TikTok or whatever we use, or the news. And we're allowing all of this barrage into our space, into our life. And then without the self-awareness for that, and it's not to say that we shouldn't ever use these devices, it's gotten way beyond that point. We can't put it back in the box, right? But we're losing the capacity to think. We're
mm,
losing the capacity for self-awareness because we're constantly being bombarded by information that our brain is not equipped to handle. We're not equipped to handle this much all at once. I
mm,
remember when I was a kid, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and the Challenger was the first real human tragedy, the Challenger exploding in the 80s with all the astronauts who died. That was the first real human tragedy that I saw, and it was a national tragedy. Everybody was talking about it, thinking about it, and now we get that constantly. We get
mm.
constant tragedy, we get constant negative information or this content development, and we just don't have time to process it, and we don't have time to think
Hmm.
about what we're processing.
It is too much. It is too much for
It's too
even
much.
my. I want to get, and I think that these tie together because the screen addiction and then substance abuse as well. So you have a lot of direct personal experience and loss with substance abuse, but also you sound like you did some work with that
Yep.
at the center as well. Um, what are you seeing with substance abuse generally, and then having a person so close to you having the substance abuse problem? What's your thoughts surrounding this? And that's a large question.
That's a big
And
question.
mm-hmm,
So I'll just start out with first what I did at ASU for around that program and for the students. So at ASU, there was no collegiate recovery program, and they wanted to build one up. So in 2015, 2016, I led the first collegiate recovery program. It was called Recovery Rising, for students both who were in substance use recovery and for students that wanted to support them. So it was a program that was largely, I directed it, but it was largely led by the students. And what they said was that they were lonely too, even then. They went to class and then they went home
mm-hmm,
because they didn't feel like the environment was conducive to their sobriety. They felt that it was an abstinence hostile space. And your perception, as we were talking about before, whether that's true or not, your perception shapes your reality. right? So
Mm-hmm.
they felt like they had nobody to turn to. They felt like they weren't welcome in this space. So what we did was we created a training for people who did want to support them and who did want to understand what it means to be in recovery, what it means to have been a student with an active addiction. And those narratives that we heard from the students in recovery, those were the most powerful sources of information because students saw, oh, these people are just like me, right? Yet they're experiencing this and they're building resilience to get over it. So that's a little bit about the program. I don't know what it's like now, but I imagine that it would be similar and even more difficult to find that community of people of support now.
Mm-hmm. Yes, seeing one of the reasons I think I got into some of these teachings and books was because of seeing a lot of addiction
Mm-hmm.
and dealing with even my own issues growing up, especially adolescence. It's just like having so much energy and having like a lot of thought energy. It
Mm-hmm.
can become so hard to center, no pun intended there, but it can be like really hard to like get to find that. And substances offer some relief from that, like marijuana, alcohol, and
Mm-hmm.
thank God I never went down like the pill rabbit hole other than experimentation. And um but I've seen it a lot, and I know that a lot of people nowadays are there's I just do you feel like there's like a crisis in meaning as well amongst people, but especially amongst the youth?
Yeah, I think that that's very accurate. I think that when we numb ourselves so much, whether it's through alcohol or drug use or even being on our apps all the time, I think that we lose the ability to become stakeholders in our own lives, right? We lose that ability to have autonomy and authority over what our life means because we're living for something else.
Hmm.
And that meaning is lost because you don't have that autonomy. And so our value system collapses. The way that we build meaning in our lives gets lost. And we need to have meaning to make our life worthwhile, whether that meaning is, rescuing dogs like I do and I find my meaning through that, or or something else, helping people or volunteering or doing great research, we lose the ability to fulfill that for ourselves, which ultimately leads to contentment and happiness.
Mm-hmm. And you seem to have done some, from my research, done some work with leadership also, or mindful leadership. What does that look like to you, and what characteristics would you say are present in a mindful leader?
That's a good question. And I love the tying of mindful leadership together because so many people think that it is opposite ends of a spectrum, right? That to be mindful, you need to be by yourself, meditating in a corner, in yoga pants. And then to be a leader, you need to be this authoritative, aggressive person. And so it's hard for some people to see the merging of those two things. But at the Center for Mindfulness, we created a mindful leadership professional development certificate, and I just taught a mindfulness leadership class. And what I hear from the students a lot is like, oh, I didn't even think that this was a thing in leadership. I didn't think that this was something that I should think about. But when you think about it, the more self awareness you have, the better leader you're going to be. The more that you are aware of your actions and how the people around you react to those, then the better you're going to be. I work with corporations too, and and this is across the board. The issues that come up are communication, teamwork, and that kind of nonverbal conflict that we sometimes see. And it's because people are not aware. It's because they're not aware of what they're doing and how it's affecting others. And
Mm-hmm.
that leads to to low morale, right? To burnout. People don't leave their job because you know, they don't necessarily leave because of money. They leave because they're not treated well. They leave
Mm-hmm.
because there's conflict. Students don't leave school only because of grades. They leave because they got into a fight with their roommate or they missed the bus, right? And they can't handle those emotions. And so, what mindfulness teaches you is to react in an intentional way rather than responding automatically without awareness. And the more that you bring mindfulness into your leadership, the more that you listen, respond with intention, and lead with the knowledge that everybody is probably doing the best that they can given the
Mm-hmm.
circumstances that they have. I think the better leader you're going to be.
Yeah, I think caring about people in a position of leadership goes a long way because I know that there are people who lead organizations or manage places, and you can get ahead being an asshole, um,
Yes.
but
And a lot
like
of
you,
people do.
yeah, but it's not exactly like from my vantage point, but it's not sustaining and it's not as valuable to yourself either because like yeah you can push people out of the way for so long but to actually truly be able to care about other people and to uh to do what's in the best interest of not only the organization but also the other people and yourself and tying those three together
Mm-hmm.
allows for a more sustained relationship to being in a leadership role. So it's cool that and a lot of people again they're reactive, they're not aware, they're not emotionally healthy. So they're trying to like have other people around them, but they're just not in a good they're not good people to be around, they're not in a good space. Not taking away, they're not a lot of people aren't bad, they're just not well.
Mm-hmm.
Um so I think that it'll stand out more now too when I see people who do lead from that space or teach from that space or run mindfulness centers. Like you can tell some people like they're more connected and they have something.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I kind of wanted to circle back a little bit to people pathologizing regular human experiences. I want to explore that a little bit because I do see that happening more and more. What are some examples of, let's say, someone having a negative experience and making it more pathological versus someone genuinely having something that they need help with?
Mm. Well, what I see in students, especially, is that everything is forever, right? When you're going through something, it feels like it's forever.
Hmm.
And when you're in school, there's, of course, difficult classes that come up, or you don't get the grades that you want, or you don't get the internships that you want. And that's a process of being in school, right? But it's maybe not pathologizing, but it's placing such enormous emphasis on these things that may not matter in 5 years or even in a year. It's just placing such great stress and pressure. I see so much pressure that students place on themselves.
Hmm.
And I'm not saying that they shouldn't, but it's also temporary, right? And I think that people are missing the temporariness of most situations. Everything is impermanent. This isn't going to last forever.
Hmm.
So the skills that you're developing now, you can carry over into something else, but it's what you're doing is not going to be forever. You're not always going to have this class. You're not always going to have this professor, right? It's not always going to be this hard. Something else might be hard, but it's not going to be exactly like this. So that's one of the examples that I see a lot of is just so much pressure that we place upon ourselves get things done and get them done under tight deadlines. And it's overwhelming to the point that people cannot function.
Hmm. Why do you think that they're putting that immense pressure on themselves?
Hmm. That's a good question. I don't remember students putting this much pressure on themselves years ago,
Hmm.
but now I feel like they are. Um, Everything just feels very urgent. We live in a
Hmm.
culture that is very immediate and very urgent. And if you don't do something, then it's it's kind of the end of the world. I don't
Hmm.
know. What do you think?
Hmm.
I'm not sure. That's a good question.
um, you know, I'm not entirely sure either because I see two sides of this. I see people who they just seem to not give a shit about anything, and then you see
Hmm.
people who they place this immense pressure on themselves to be perfect. Maybe it's parents. Social media definitely can contribute, and then I think the way that social media contributes and this perfectionistic thing is that there's all these answers, like supposed answers out there
Yeah.
that we like have to have something figured out. And so instead of what you said, I don't know. Instead of saying that, they need to have everything figured out. They need to know what they want to do. Um, and I had a lot of pressure on myself as
Hmm.
well. I didn't finish college. I think for me, it was a lot of non action that was driving my anxiety, which was a
Hmm.
problem and then once I took action on certain things, it mitigated it a little bit. But I definitely think removing the pressure of feeling like you need to have the perfect answer to your uncertain existence is is a better is a better place to be. But I relay this to young people because I'm in management where I'm working around people that are in school and they're like, I don't know what I want to do, and I'm like, just do honestly, just do something.
Do
Like
something.
start start somewhere, and also remove the idea that something's going to be perfect immediately. And because once you begin something, you know, you're not sitting with your thoughts trying to perfect it,
Hmm.
and then you're out in the world, and then over time you can figure out, oh well, I hate doing this? Do I like doing this? If you like it a little bit, it can grow into something you like a lot of bit.
Hmm.
There's definitely room for advancement, and then also removing the idea that your work is your entire life. Like what you do for a position doesn't occupy it is so fucking not like everything that you are and encompass. Like that's just one piece of something that you do. Who you are is so much deeper. And I learn a lot of that from the immigrants that I work with because they have a task, but their life is their family, and they're you know, they're hard working people, but they don't attach themselves so much to a role as we do in America,
I
in
think we
North America.
absolutely do. Yeah, and it's terrible to see, and I think certain professions are more prone to that, especially kind of the helping professions where you're working with other people and you're trying to help them better their lives. You really attach a great identity to that, and that's very, very difficult. You talk about immigrants, and my family is Russian from Ukraine, and my great grandfather was an engineer in Russia, and my great grandmother was an actress. And then they came over here and they were janitors in a hospital.
Mm.
And to them, the meaning there was that they got to be here. They got to
Mhm.
provide for their family, right? But that they were able to separate this idea that they were their job. And I don't think we're able to do that right now. I don't, in this society, it's very hard to distance yourself from how you get a paycheck.
Mhm. Maybe it's engineered that way. I don't know. Maybe people want people, but it also is just like, yeah, the quality of your thoughts, your relationships, your what you read, what you consume. That's equally as important as what you do for a paycheck, or more important. So so yeah, I mean, I think that I don't know. So in your new, I'm curious, in your new role, how do you, can you actually explain one more time the new role that you're taking with ASU?
It's
If you
still,
want to.
yeah, it's still in development. I don't have a lot to report because it's still relatively new, but it's under the chief wellness officer, and so I'm working on things like the friendship bench, which is an initiative that was started by one of our professors here, and it comes from a program overseas, actually, where um, elders in the community sit on a bench and they talk to whoever wants to talk to them. And it's
Hmm.
been really, really popular because there's such a low barrier to entry. Nobody has to fill out paperwork, nobody has to be a psychologist. People are just talking to each other.
Hmm.
And so this role is a lot about building back that sense of community, at least at ASU and our immediate environment, and providing students that connection and sense of belonging that we might be missing right now.
Hmm. And what, as someone who is in this role, and as we're talking about life and work and roles, what is a lot of your life like as someone who's interested in mindfulness and interested in finding meaning and reading books? What's your outside work world?
Well, I definitely fall prey to what we were just talking about having a sense of identity that is directly tied to my job. And it makes it especially difficult because this is the kind of, I teach the kind of stuff that I'm going to be doing anyway in my personal life, right?
Yeah, it's
So
who you are.
that's what makes it even more difficult. Like if I lost my job tomorrow, I would have a complete breakdown because I wouldn't know who I was anymore.
Hmm.
But I teach yoga. I do some consulting work with corporations on their wellness. I have 4 dogs and I foster other dogs. And I work.
Hmm. You're
That's what I
taking
do.
care of a lot of other creatures,
A lot of other creatures, yeah.
dogs and humans.
Dogs and humans.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, well, and again, it's actually a really good thing to find a job that is related to what your interests are. I mean, I think that that's a good thing.
It's a good thing, but if it doesn't go the way that you want it to go, then what does that mean for you? Is your
Hmm.
life not going the way that you want it to go? It's too merged. Sometimes I wish that I could leave my job. It wouldn't be as fulfilling, but if I could leave my job at 5 o'clock, then
Hmm.
I wouldn't have that sense of ownership over it.
Hmm.
You know,
True.
both good and bad.
True. Maybe you'd get depressed though if you didn't have the extra responsibility. I don't know.
I'll get depressed either way.
Well, it's good to know yourself, and to know your orientation. One of the interesting things that I learned by coming to Arizona, so I moved from New Jersey 3 years ago, and I, New Jersey is a bit more of an intense place, and maybe I'm just an intense person in an intense place, and then my family is kind of very like a lot of my family members are Type A too, um, which I wouldn't necessarily consider myself all the time, but it's just when you're surrounded with that, it impacts your thoughts. And then one thing I learned by moving here was how to have fun again. I feel like, I always did fun things, but I think I just had this like regimented mindset where
Mhm.
I had I don't know, I just feel like I have a great time out here. And the reason I'm talking about that is because I think that a lot of people, and I think that this can tie into mindfulness and meditation as well, is that they just don't. You can probably hear my dog outside, this fucker. The but my roommate's dog technically, um, but the reason I'm tying this in is because I think that it is important to enjoy life, and this because we're not gonna be here one day,
Right.
and life is a short journey, and other people's lives are short, and if you're not enjoying it, even in spite of the things that you have to take seriously, you just gotta enjoy life and tap into that. And I think that that's like the image of the laughing Buddha is in my mind. Like that's what the essence of so much of this is about, and connecting and loving and realizing that it's all it's all a fading process.
It is. And you bring up this really great point that we are also missing is that sense of joy. I don't see joy in many people anymore.
Mm,
Even those fleeting moments of joy are really hard to find because you're not going to find them on your phone. You're going to find them through awe inspiring mountains or the sky or having a really good laugh. And we're not really doing so much of that anymore.
mm,
And that's a great disservice to ourselves and to our lives.
mm. And I want to ask, I want to ask you to maybe, if there's something you want to leave with people or with this audience, what would some words that you've leaned on over the years, specifically in the hardest times of your life, what are some teachings and some things that you've leaned on, and how did you find your way through the darker times in life, and what would you want to share with others?
I feel like I should have prepped for this a little
That's
bit
all right.
more with with those resources because there are a lot. There's a Buddhist chant that I really love, and I can't remember the name of it, and it's so beautiful. I'll find it and I'll send it to you. But there's music and
Mm-hmm.
singing, and that was really vital to me because it was a sense that I think music is also transformative and transports you to another world, just like being out in nature or looking at the sky. So music, I'll remember exactly in a little bit, and just
That's all right.
reading books from the masters who have also experienced life. Yeah, Thich Nhat Hanh, Pima Chodron, and yeah.
Hmm. And for you personally, so you found music meaningful, you found new relationships, you have a job that is meaningful to you.
And
So,
also going back to school, that was really transformative for me. I when I was doing my dissertation, it was with the students in recovery, and I think that if you don't transform your grief, if you don't transform those experiences into something else, whatever that might look like, you just hold on to it. And so I felt like I kind of transposed the experience that I went through into something that was supportive of others and was able to let it be in the past.
mm. And I had one more question, and I can leave this in or not, but I just are you, there's also there's a whole research lab at ASU, and I'm talking to a person behind some of it. But what if you have thoughts on like altered states and psychedelic research for trauma, for meditation, do you have thoughts or narrative around that for positive or negative?
I think it can be used for positive for sure.
Mm,
I don't know a lot of the scientific knowledge behind it, but it's an area that really needs to be explored. And we lost years of research on how psychedelics or other ways, dissociative drugs, can help us. It's not all talk therapy. It's not all just sharing our emotions. There's a lot of trauma that is internalized and really in your skin and bones, you know?
mm,
There's a form of yoga that we did in the recovery community called Y12SR, and the tagline is "the issues are in the tissues." And so,
mm,
by releasing the stored trauma within yourself physically, you can kind of let it go. And so I really believe that there's a physical component, there's a mental component, there's a brain component, and we need to use all of them to see
Mm,
what works best for us. So I am 100% for that kind of research.
mm.
100%.
Well, thank you. Thank you for joining me. I have a small timeline here. I really enjoyed talking to you. I'm going to keep you in the studio after I
Okay.
shut off the recording, but
Okay.
thank you.
Thank
Um,
you. This was
mhm.
fun.
Thanks for tuning in, guys. Remember to like the show, follow, subscribe. I'm available on YouTube and Spotify. Thank you.